Get started. All right, so I will pull up the, okay.
Go ahead.
All right, Russ, take it away.
Right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third session of the Property Manager, Case Manager Annual Meeting as part of Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing. Today, we're joined by Lakeisha Vaughn and Meg DiPasquale, who will be talking about trauma-informed care and the Violence Against Women Act. Vawa, I guess that's how it's pronounced. As a bit of housekeeping, please make sure you put any questions you have in the question answers, and we'll take questions at the end or answer directly to respondents along the way if we can. For logistical and technical purposes, go ahead and place any other thoughts you may have or questions into the chat section. A recording of this presentation will be uploaded to the Maryland Department of Disability's YouTube channel for viewing. So participants will be provided with copies of the PowerPoint presentation at the end of the session. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Meg DiPasquale, who's the Director of Clinical Services for Developmental Disability Administration, and Lakeisha Vaughn, the Deputy Director of Special Population Programs for the Department of Housing and Community Development. Glad you could join us.
Thank you. Hi, good morning, everybody. Like I was just introduced, my name is Dr. Meg DiPasquale, and I am the Director of Clinical Services for the Developmental Disabilities Administration. And I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma-informed support for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Next slide, please. Before I get started, I do want to put out there that I work very closely with Dr. Karen Harvey, who is a psychologist who has worked with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities for over 20 plus years. She is right here in Baltimore City, and her and I work very closely and collectively in regards to trauma. And she actually is a very big piece of this presentation. A lot of the information that I'm going to speak about is what Karen has shared with myself as well as other individuals over the course of the years that she's been working with this population. So I just wanted to put out there, thank you, Karen. I appreciate all of your support. So sources of trauma. In 2013, the Spectrum Institute had a report on abuse for people with disabilities. And over 70% of those people with disabilities report being a victim of abuse. 90% of that 70% said it would happen on multiple occasions, and only 37% of reported the abuse to authorities. The type of abuse that was reported was physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, social trauma, bullying, name calling, verbal abuse. There's been trauma in institutionalizations, and then foster care placements. Next slide, please. NPR identified that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are 7 times more likely to be sexually abused than those individuals that do not have a disability. And in 2017, the Bureau of Justice reports that people with disabilities are 2.5 times more likely to be victims of a violent crime. And 40% of those individuals know the perpetrator that perpetrated against them. Next slide. So there's a lot of different traumas that are out there, and we try to define them as either big T's or little T's. And many of you probably are aware of the big T traumas, which would be like major events such as, excuse me, physical abuse or sexual abuse, neglect, grief, and loss. But there are a lot of little T traumas that can equally affect somebody, such as being discriminated against or living in a neighborhood that has a lot of violence, being socially excluded, and exclusion from family. And I'll talk a little bit about that trauma in regards to here recently with our COVID pandemic that we've had. There's also little T traumas that are being, through frequent foster care or group home placements, that you see a lack of stability in somebody's upbringing as they've been being pulled from place to place to place. Next slide, please. So early childhood trauma, I think it's important for individuals to recognize that abuse and neglect can have a lifelong impact. There was a Bucharest early intervention orphan study that was done. And what they did was they looked at children, 136 children that were between the ages of 6 months and 31 months, who were in an orphanage in Bucharest, and they were studied over 4.5 years. 68 of those infants were kept in an institution, and 68 were placed in a new foster care system that Bucharest had just developed with full-time paid parenting. And then they compared those 136 children that were either in the institution or in this foster care system with individuals with children of the same age group that were raised with their birth families, and they were able to compare them with 138 children. And that just happens to be the link if you wanted to link on that actual study. Next slide. And what they found was that those individuals that were in institutions, 55% of them had an Axis 1 diagnosis, and that Axis 1 diagnosis would be where you would see things such as ADHD or major depression or bipolar, and as compared to those 35% of those children that were in that paid foster care program, there was only 35% of them that developed that Axis 1 diagnosis, as opposed to 13% that lived in their biological families. Emotional disorders, 49%. So almost half of those individuals that were in the institutions had that diagnosis of emotional disorder, which could be, you know, something like intermittent explosive disorder, or again, bipolar disorder. 29% in foster care and only 8% in the biological families. Behavioral disorders, the institution, you know, those children, it was 32%. So a third of those children ended up being diagnosed with a behavioral disorder, as opposed to only 6.8% of the biological children. And then if you looked at their disability, their IQ scores, you could see that individuals that were in the institution had an average IQ of 73, which is what we would consider mildly intellectually disabled, whereas foster care was 85, which is considered average, as biological is 110, which again is in the average, slightly above average range. So just looking at how that early intervention of having consistent care in an infant's life, how it can affect their growth and development as they you know, mature and get older. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk about the trauma of COVID. We've all dealt with a national, global pandemic over the last 1.5 years, almost 2 years now. Next slide. And there's been a lot of trauma. You know, the big T traumas, the loss of loved ones. You know, I don't know, you know, how many of us have lost a loved one. And this could also be somebody that, if it was an individual that we work with intellectual and developmental disability, it could be a loss of a staff that they've had in their lives for a very long period of time. An indirect exposure via the media. I mean, we've been saturated with talk about COVID. I don't think you can go on any TV channel without seeing some little ticker tape saying how many people have COVID and what the percentages are. This is a global mass trauma event that we haven't seen since the likes of World War II. And they are, you know, it really has affected individuals. Having a severe case of COVID is a traumatic event. One of the individuals, I was reading an article and I wanted to put it in here, and it's in quotes: being unable to breathe is the most traumatic event you can imagine. And this is from an individual that survived COVID, but ended up on a ventilator because they couldn't breathe on their own, and just the trauma of having that gasping for breath. There is a gentleman with the Bessel van Kolk who does a lot of work on trauma, and trauma, for how he describes it, is that not being able to predict what's going to happen can be cause a lot of trauma. Being isolated. How many of us, you know, were stay-at-home orders? We couldn't go anywhere. We couldn't be anywhere. We had to stay home, grocery shop, and then back. So you're being isolated from your day to day. Many of us that work for the state, as many of you that work in the housing, you know, you interact with individuals on a day to day basis, and then being told you can't. I mean, that can cause a lot of trauma and feeling of unpredictability, being immobile, not being able to go anywhere. And that all plays into a loss of sense of safety. I mean, how many of us were worried about, you know, what was going to happen, not only to us, but to our family, and a loss of sense of purpose. I know, you know, being able to go to work every day, even though, you know, yeah, we liked having some time off, you know, after a while, you know, you wanted to get back to what, you know, what you do for a living, and the things that you do and interact with other people give you that sense of purpose. And when that's taken from you, it kind of gives you that, like, you know, who am I and why am I here on earth type of thought process. Next slide. So everything that I just talked about in regards to trauma, you know, those are things that can affect us and regular individuals that have a regular average IQ, and they also affect individuals that have intellectual and developmental disabilities as well. I can't talk about trauma without talking about the ACEs study. If none of you are familiar with it, it has to do with the adverse childhood experience. This was a study that was done back in the 1990s by a huge insurance company in California. And what they recognized is that by the number of adverse childhood experiences, such as some of those big T's that I talked about, abuse, neglect, as well as living in a community where you saw violence, having maybe a family member arrested, things like that, the number of these adverse experiences can cause disruptions in the way that you grow and how you develop, and it influences your health and well-being throughout your lifespan. So the number of adverse childhood experiences that happen, as you can see with the pyramid, if you go up, it disrupts your neurodevelopment, which then can, and I'll talk a little bit about this in detail, as you move forward, it goes into the social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. You adopt at-risk health risk behaviors to help deal with some of those issues, such as drinking, smoking, maybe use of drugs. All of those things can cause disease, disability, social problems, and eventually early death. A lot of individuals that tend to use maladaptive coping skills, such as alcohol, drugs, smoking, etc., tend to, you know, they're not the healthiest people in the world, and you know, the age in which they pass on is a lot younger than somebody that maybe did not use those types of types of coping mechanisms. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about psychological trauma, which is, we look back at that ACEs pyramid, that neurocognitive disruption, that second little section. So our brain is designed that it goes from the back of your brain to the front of your brain. So the back of your brain, that red area, the reptilian brain, it's a primitive brain. It's called reptilian because it's kind of like the reptile. It really affects those areas in your brain that really just focus on keeping you alive, your breathing, your sense of safety, you know, fight or flight comes from there. And it comes back from, you know, back in the day when you know, there's always things that can cause us to be at risk. So it's responsible for fight, flight, or freeze, which is an area that I'm not sure if many individuals are familiar with, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. Then your midbrain, that limbic system, that houses the hippocampus and the amygdala, which is considered your emotional brain, and it plays an important role in motivation. And there's a lot of neuroactivity that goes on with an emotional experience. So this is where emotional attachment comes into play. And a lot of that comes with like play-based behavior. So like when you're a toddler and you see little kids playing with one another and maybe they don't want to share, and then they do start to share, that's the limbic brain starting to develop neural net sequences that allow for emotional attachment. And it's a bit more sophisticated than the reptilian brain. And then the green area that says neocortex, that's our rational brain. That's where executive functioning occurs. That's like where, like your forehead, I always tap my forehead and say that's where your executive functioning is. And so that's the last part of your brain that actually is developed as you're growing up. And this is where intellectual tasks are starting, and this is where your brain starts to weigh actions and consequences. So like, and your neocortex, your executive functioning, really doesn't fully develop until the age of 25. So like when you see teenagers that are doing really high risk, silly behaviors, and you wonder, you know, as an adult, you're like, wow, I can't believe that they're doing that. They're really being risky. That's because their brain hasn't fully developed and they haven't got the whole consequence to their behavior completely nailed down. And some of them do get it, but also too, it's important to recognize that individuals that have an intellectual developmental disability and or have trauma in their life, that rational brain, when they get overstimulated, when they are feeling that their safety is at risk, that shuts down. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next couple slides, but that shuts down. So that rational piece, you're trying to talk to somebody that's having, you know, issues maybe in their house with either a neighbor or maybe a staff person that's working with them. They're not being rational at that point, and you can't talk them out of where they're at because that rational piece is completely shut down. Next slide, please. So as I said, the trauma response. There's a story that I always talk about is that, you know, if you're walking through the woods and you saw a bear, right, your trauma, your fight or flight or freeze instinct would come into, right? It's something that happens, is that trigger response that this could be a negative experience. If you see a bear, it could possibly be negative. So you either fight, right, which probably wouldn't be a good idea if it was a bear. You run or you freeze and you try to like hopefully let the bear walk away. So what happens is that when you have that trauma response, your cortisol, the adrenaline, that all starts to kick in, your heart starts to race, you have tunnel vision. We've all been in those types of situations where we've been scared and, you know, you can feel your muscles twitching and your heart's pounding and you're not really thinking straight at that point. What I try to remind people is that for somebody that's been in a traumatic event, somebody that has lived with trauma, maybe they were abused as a child or they saw a family member being abused, that trauma response has become permanently fixed in their brain. So that bear in the woods is always with them. For us, we have a traumatic experience, such as maybe a car accident or the bear in the woods example. And then we go on our merry little way and we're no longer exposed to that. And our cortisol and our adrenaline goes back to normal, our heart goes back to normal, and we can continue to move forward with very little repercussion. But if you have a trauma or you're living in a traumatic environment, that cortisol, that adrenaline, that it constantly is going and it affects your brain. It affects the way that the neurons and the synapses are working in your brain, and you can get stuck in a trauma response. Next slide, please. So as I said, that with a trauma response, you have a trauma mind and a trauma response. Like I said, it activates fight, flight, or freeze. The rational mind shuts down. People will sometimes revert back to the age that the trauma first occurred when in a trauma response mode. As I said before, this is not a teachable moment. You don't try to talk them through this. When they're in a trauma response, you kind of have to help them through that process. You might see them regress to a younger age. You may see what I call the terrible twos meltdown. Some of you may have seen this with some of the clients you work with that have intellectual and developmental disability. They're breaking things, they're throwing things, they're yelling, they're cussing people out. They're really having, they're having a meltdown, for lack of a better word. Next slide. So the body stores trauma. You may hear people talk about having gastrointestinal issues or phantom pain. They may have an exaggerated response to pain. It's important to think about the health conditions like I talked about with the ACEs. The way the body reacts to trauma, it doesn't always mean they're faking, oh, I have a stomach ache. Oh, I have a stomach ache. It could be that, that's where they're holding their trauma and they're having stomach issues. They could also, because of all that cortisol and adrenaline that I talked about a few slides ago that have been permeating their brain, it also affects the other systems in their body, and they could have developed GERD, gastro reflux. They could develop an ulcer, which can obviously cause stomach pains. Things like that their body will do to yourself without you even realizing, and it could be because of trauma. That's always something that when we look at an individual that's having all of these issues, we ask a lot about health questions, and part of that is to see if there's a connection there. Next slide, please. So what to do when someone's triggered. So here you are, you've got a person that's in an apartment or that you're overseeing or you're working with, and they're having a meltdown. What do? These are just some simple things that anyone can do to assist somebody when they're upset. First of all, make sure you're calm, because if you're worked up and you're getting your own trauma experience happening, it's not going to help calm the situation. So make sure that you're calm. Take a couple breaths, recognize where you are, recognize, is this something that you can handle, or do you need to see if maybe somebody else that you're working with can step in if this is causing you to have your own trauma response. Try to get that person away from the trigger if possible. Provide reassurance and comfort. Help them with deep breathing, just having them take deep breaths. Talk to them in a very calm voice. Don't be over dramatic. I tend to talk with my hands a lot, but I know when I'm working with clients, I work to ensure that I'm not using my hands when I talk, because that can cause people to get a little defensive. So make sure that the way that you are presenting yourself is calm, your disposition is calm. Don't get into a power struggle. If they're saying that, the radio is talking to them, don't tell them no, it's not. Just, okay, I can understand that that's upsetting you. How about if we step out of the bedroom and into another room so that you're not by the radio? You don't have to get into a power struggle about it. Next slide. You want to help the smart brain, the front of the brain process. So listen to what they're saying, give them empathy, validate their feelings. You don't have to advise them on what to do in the moment. Just validate their feelings, give them empathy, let them know that they're safe. Don't instruct them what they should do. Also, don't shame them for how they're feeling or how they're responding to their trauma trigger. It's their trauma. It may not make sense to you, but for them, it's very real in that moment. And what we're trying to do, what you're trying to do is just calm the situation down, understand that this could be something from 10 years ago. It may have nothing to do with the moment, but because of a sight, a sound, a smell, it's bringing them back to a trauma. Next slide. So post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a lot of our individuals do suffer from this. It's a spectrum. And when I say it's a spectrum, is you can have people that have very mild symptoms. They may just get stuck in the moment, to people that are very, very acute with their symptomology and are actually reliving a trauma experience. Hopefully what you're dealing with, in your situations is that mild area. However, if you do have somebody that is to that level, I'm assuming and hoping that they have staff that are working with them, that have behavior plans and know how to follow them, to ensure that we're providing what they need to help bring themselves back to the here and now. Sometimes the behaviors we really see are symptoms of PTSD. So if that screaming, that yelling, that cussing out, that breaking of objects could just be that you're seeing symptoms. And there are 4 areas that you might be that somebody might be experiencing that you might be actually visually seeing. Next slide, please. So re-experiencing is a symptom that you might see. and that is interfering with the present in different degrees. So they're re-experiencing their trauma. It could be an intrusive memory. They constantly are remembering something. They could be having nightmares. That could be why maybe a lot of the time, sometimes when you guys might see some issues in the apartments that you're overseeing or working with, it's typically, it could be at the night hours, evening to like in the middle of the night. It could be because they're having nightmares. A lot of individuals that have had traumatic experiences, unfortunately, times it happens when they should be asleep. People could also have flashbacks. They can't really disconnect from reality and be convinced that their memory has resurfaced in the present, and they really are feeling as if they're being attacked or hurt or threatened. And so they're in that moment, they've disconnected from the fact that they are in a safe, calm environment, which is why in a few slides up, I was telling you to be calm yourself, try to listen and validate, and don't try to rationalize what they're going through. Just try to, if they feel like they're threatened, okay, how can we help you feel more safe? Can we take you to another room? Something to that extent. Is there a staff person or somebody that we can call to help you calm down? Next slide is avoidance. So avoidance really can mirror some of our challenging behaviors like non-compliance, like, nope, I'm not going to do X and Y and Z, and you can't tell me to, or paranoia. So they're very blunt emotions. So blunt emotions means that they just really don't have any emotional range. They don't smile, they don't laugh, they don't cry. They're just kind of like poker face, right? They may have a lot of phobias. They may not want to leave their house. They may be afraid of loud noises, certain smells. I had a young lady that I worked with many years ago that the smell of Chinese would cause her to go into she would just shut down because that smell reminded her of a trauma that she had when she was a child, and she would literally, you could not move her. And so what we recognized was when Chinese was on the menu, she was not there at dinner, and we would take her somewhere else so that she just would not be in that environment. But that takes a little bit of time to figure those things out. But sometimes they just completely shut down. Not that they're trying to be non-compliant. It's not that they're trying to, do this just to drive you crazy. It's because they're having an experience to a traumatic event that maybe they're replaying in their head. They also could be hypervigilant. They may become very obsessive about details concerning their self and safety. They want to make sure that you've got locks on the doors, and there's you've got plenty of fire extinguishers, and what's the response time for 911. So they may call 911 a lot. So then some of that is hypervigilance. They may disassociate, which means that once again they're breaking from reality in that moment. They may have selective mutism, which means they can chit chat and have a great conversation with you one day, but then when they shut down, they're not talking. And they may also be blocking memories. Next slide, please. So negative alteration in cognition and mood. That is a way of just saying that how an individual can be viewed by others in a negative light. So you may see this person or describe them as moody or not caring about how their behaviors affect their ability to be in the community. So they, their constricted emotions or inability to express positive emotions, that makes maybe people think that they're moody. They have an sense of impending doom, like something's going to happen. They're hopeless, they're helpless, they have negative views about themselves. They're not really people you want to be around because they're kind of like really down and depressed and moody, and you just don't really want to be around them. And so you're kind of like, well, they act this way, they're pushing us away, so they don't really care. And if they're going to continue to be this way, then we can't keep them in this apartment because they're causing everybody else to feel uncomfortable. And really a lot of it is that they have these negative emotions because of the trauma that they've been through. They have such feelings of guilt and shame and anger and fear that this is how they're presenting it to the community, how they're presenting it to the people that they may not see on a day-to-day basis. The staff that work with them, whether they work with them every single day and live in the apartment that they're in, or they just are doing drop-in support, probably have a better understanding. And so the piece of this is for people to recognize that we don't know what other people have been through. We haven't walked a mile in their shoes. So try not to always presume or make an assumption about somebody based off of behaviors. It's hard to do, and I understand that, because when people are acting this way, it's very easy to want to push away because nobody wants to be around a gloomy Gus. However, it may not be that they're intentionally wanting to be that way. Next slide. So the last area is arousal. And this can be problematic because this is where you see that uncontrollable aggressive behavior, which causes other people that interact with them to shut down or to take things personally or not want to assist or possibly want to call the police, right? So this arousal phase that is part of PTSD, that's where you see hyperarousal. You see agitation, which can lead to property destruction, aggression. In their mind, the best defense is a good offense. So, they may be combative, they're impulsive, they have a startle response. They're very easy to startle. You can scare them very easily. They're going to try to protect themselves at all costs. They could barricade themselves in their room, really, and do so much damage that everybody else is out of the apartment waiting back and just waiting for the police because they don't know what else to do because they don't want to get hurt. And that individual could be doing all these things because if I can keep everybody away from me, then I know I'm going to stay safe. It's also associated with reckless or self-destructive behaviors as well. So the next slide, please. Secondary trauma. I think it's really important to stop here for a minute to talk about vicarious traumatization and how other people can be traumatized. You can absorb the pain and trauma of the people that you're working with without even realizing it. So if you're dealing with the situation of having an individual in one of your houses, or one of these individuals is your client, and you're hearing about all these horrible things that have happened, you can absorb some of that in your inner psyche and not even realize it. And I think it's important for you to recognize that this can happen and really be able to do some, self-assessment of, okay, I wasn't feeling this way yesterday, but I am today, and I'm working with Sally. What is it about Sally's past that I may know about that might be affecting me? And if it is starting to affect you, then that's when you need to reach out to your supervisor or to your employer to see, is there something out there? Maybe you have an EAP, an employee assistance program or something like that to help you get through it. Because it's really important that you don't absorb what other people are going through. And to build those boundaries. It's also very hard to do that as well without support. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So this is what's needed for a person who suffers with trauma to feel safe and to interact with others in a more pro-social way. Perceived safety, that they are safe. Connection with individuals outside, within their community and in their inner circle, and empowerment. Next slide. So perceived safety. Maslow has a hierarchy of needs. And you need to meet the lower levels before you can move forward. And so perceived safety is, so the very bottom layer of Maslow is psychological safety is satisfied, like security, and safety becomes salient. So you want to have that perceived safety. You want to have emotional safety, being with people who care about you. No surprise attacks from anybody within your house or apartment. Meaning if you have a roommate, that they're not coming at you verbally or yelling at you, or your staff aren't doing that. No surprise attacks from anyone. Meaning that, excuse me, that when you're interacting with somebody, that you're coming across calm, that you're a safe person to be around, the environment you're in is a safe environment. Letting somebody know that you understand them and that you're allowed to disagree with them. And safety is not just a physical thing. It needs to be People need to experience order and predictability and control in their lives. And when they don't have those things, it causes them to have those, excuse me. When they don't have those things, that's when they revert back to a younger age. That's when they revert back to fight or flight. These needs can be fulfilled by family and by society. Kids get this when they're in school. We get this growing up. We are taught that the police are to keep us safe, firefighters are to keep us safe, teachers are to keep us safe, right? Doctors are to keep us safe. When we get medical care, when we don't feel good, that ingrains into us that, you know, we are being kept safe. Emotional security, financial security, meaning that people can be employed, law and order, there's freedom from fear, social stability, safety against accidents and injury, meaning that our health and well-being are being taken care of. You know, those are all things that are needed for that perceived safety. Next slide. Connections. So connections are really important. Our individuals that we serve that have intellectual and developmental disabilities, a lot of them have paid supports. They have people that come in to work with them, right? They may not have any friends or people they consider to be friends that aren't paid. Like they think their staff are their friends because they see them on a daily basis. But how many of them are going out into the community and interacting with other individuals, whether they have similar disabilities or not, that they have friends that have similar likes and interests? You know, that's an important thing that we try to do through DDA and through our case management services and through the providers that work with our individuals, is try to get them engaged in the community and interested in things that they like to do. You know, having real dates, being able to go out on a date. The individuals we serve, they want to be loved. They want to have relationships. They should be in consenting relationships. So we want to make sure that the relationships that they're having, those connections, are consensual. They should have families that are safe. They should have access to phones and computers, especially right now with all of these things that have happened with COVID. Everything's been virtual. This training right now is being done virtually. Because we have access to computers to interact with our friends and families that way, to be able to call people. Those are ways to have our individuals be connected as well. The ability to both succeed and fail in relationships. We're not always going to have, every relationship isn't going to be perfect, but having the chance to be able to repair and restore a relationship is huge in regards to feeling that you've got safety and that you can recover from a traumatic event, because it helps people recognize that not everybody is out to hurt them. Next slide. Empowerment. Being able to make real choices, not fake ones, you know, like being able to make choices of where they live, who they want to interact with, what activities they want to do, having opportunities for growth, being able to fail and then try again. You know, that's how we learn. Not being a tourist in their lives or their communities, really being able to having a meaningful day and being able to say, this is what I want to do. I'm not just visiting in this house. This is my home. This is where I live. This is where I'm safe. And a voice that's heard and rights that are real. Next slide. Positive identity. That's something that we want, you know, we all want to have a positive identity. We want to be able to hold up a mirror and see the best self that we can be. So we want to be able to show that and help individuals with IDD to do that. Pointing out and focusing on their strengths, especially if they have a disability. A lot of times people have always focused on what they haven't been able to do. Well, what can they do? What are the areas that they really excel at? You know, maybe they're artistic, maybe they have a beautiful voice, maybe they're just a really friendly, upbeat person when they're not in having a trauma flashback. We want to help coach those positive experiences. So, you know, maybe if you are managing a group of apartments or what have you, and you having different meet and greet activities within that apartment complex, ensuring that our individuals are a part of that, so that they can have those positive experiences, and that, you know, they are able to not be a tourist in their community, that they actually feel like they're part of it. Maybe if you have a homeowners association or apartment association, having them be a part of those things. That's ways of helping them be connected, having them feel empowered, and giving them that positive identity, and having them feel that they are, the more that their neighbors know who they are when they're in a good spot, maybe will help them feel a little more compassion when maybe they're struggling a little bit. Next slide. Self-care. It's important for everybody to take care of yourself. Take time for yourself, do what you love, take care of you, because this helps with feelings of burnout. It helps with that vicarious traumatization that I was talking a few slides up about. Making sure that you're doing things that you feel good about, whether it be taking long walks, reading a book, yoga, whatever it might be. Make sure that you take care of yourself, because I'm sure that you all are dealing with a lot of stress, especially with COVID and everybody being stuck at home. I'm sure that having all these other individuals coming at you with this problem or that problem, you can definitely burn out. I wanted to make sure to put out there that BHA and MedChi Behavioral Health are having a webinar series about helping others, helping the helpers and those they serve. So October 28th, they're doing a webinar on putting your self-care on a pedestal, which is just what I was talking about for a minute, about self-care. This is the link for it. I know the slides will be available after the presentation, so you can go back and link to get that to register if you'd like to go to that one on the 28th. December 9th is Coping with Behavioral Health, the Impact with the Pandemic. And that's the link for that webinar. And the reason why those are the only two I have in here is because they had on the information that I got, we're off for Veterans Day, so they're not having one that week. We're off for Thanksgiving, so we're not having one that week. So these are the two that they are having that you guys would be able to get to. And I think once you link into and register for one of them, I think you get on their mailing list. And so you'll see what other trainings they'll have, coming into the new year. Next slide. That shows you the links. Okay, and then there's the next slide with the one for December 9th. And then the last slide is just if you have any other questions, that's my email and my cell phone. You can feel free to give me a call. Actually, it's probably better if you have questions, just email me and we set up a time to talk, because I never know when I'm going to be in a meeting. But if you call, leave a voicemail, I'll definitely get back to you that way as well. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
All right, very good.
That was great. It was very informative. I learned a lot on that one.
Very much so.
Okay, so yeah, just Erin had said I do not see the links. Erin, we can pop that in the chat for you, okay? We'll just go ahead and put the links in the chat. Russ, could you handle copying and pasting the links into the chat?
Yes, I'll do that. Those are
All
from
right.
the PowerPoint for the MedChi
Yep.
webinars.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you. All right, so I'll go ahead and pull up Lakeisha's presentation. I did see that you sent me another one. A second.
Excuse me. Mute myself.
Okay. Okay. All right. I believe this was the right one. All right.
Yep. Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, everyone. Again, my name is Lakeisha Vaughn. I am the Deputy Director at DHCD for the programs assisting persons with special population programs. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be talking today about the Violence Against Women Act. And this act was reauthorized in 2013 and signed into public law on March 7th, 2013. So this act actually updated some of the protections and things that were in the initial Violence Against Women Act of 2005. And then I'm also going to be talking about the 2016 final rule that was published in 2016, and some of those protections were actually made effective 2017. So the Violence Against Women Act of 2013, Title VI, entitled Safe Homes for Victims of Domestic Violence, Dating Violence, Sexual Assault, and Stalking. Section 601 speaks specifically about housing protections for victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And it also expanded those protections that were originally just for Section 8 in public housing to additional housing programs to include Section 811 as well as Section 202 housing programs. And under this revision, it prohibits the denial of assistance or eviction of victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. Next slide, please. Housing protections for tenants and applicants. Applicants for or tenants of housing assisted under a covered housing program may not be denied assistance or terminated from housing on the basis of an applicant or tenant being a victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, if otherwise the applicant qualifies for admission, assistance, participation, or occupancy in a HUD program. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Lease terms and termination. An incident of actual or threatened domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking may not be considered a serious lease or repeated lease violation for housing assisted under a covered program by victim or threatened victim of such incident, as well as denial of assistance, tenancy, and occupancy on the basis of criminal activity. So no person can be denied assistance, tenancy, or occupancy if the criminal activity was directly related to the criminal activity of stalking, domestic violence, dating violence, or sexual assault by a household member or a guest, other person, or under the control of the tenant. Next slide, please. Bifurcation of a lease. So a public housing agency owner or manager of an assisted housing may bifurcate a lease. So in other words, they may remove the person that is committing the criminal activity. They can remove or evict that person from the lease while allowing the victim of the domestic violence incident, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking incident to remain in the unit without penalty. That would be a lease bifurcation. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about the Vawa final rule and the implementation of the Vawa Act of 2013. That's basically what the final rule was. It provides guidance to housing agencies and housing programs on how to actually implement the Act of 2013. So it revises requirements for documenting the occurrence of a domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking incident. It also establishes reasonable time periods for a tenant who is a Vawa victim to remain in the unit while establishing eligibility or seek alternate housing after a lease bifurcation. So this would be specific to a person, for example, in an 811 unit where the victim does not actually qualify for or was not the original qualifying member of the household for the 811 unit. So it actually gives the remaining household member time to be determined if they do qualify or otherwise to locate alternate housing. So it also clarifies that owners and agents may establish preferences for victims of dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, in addition to domestic violence. It specifies sexual assault as a crime covered by Vawa, as in the original Violence Against Women Act. Sexual assault was not a covered protection. It also establishes a new requirement for notice of occupancy rights under the Violence Against Women Act, which is HUD Form 5380, as well as establishes requirements for creating an emergency transfer plan and for related record keeping and reporting. Next slide, please. The Vawa final rule, as I stated previously, provides implementation guidance on the 2013 Vawa Reauthorization Act. It was published in November of 2016, and most of the provisions and requirements were effective December of 2016. However, the emergency transfer plan was required to be completed by owners and agents by June 14th of 2017. And it applies to all assisted multifamily housing, including family, elderly, and disabled housing projects. Next slide, please. Who is eligible for Vawa protections? So all applicants and tenants under a HUD housing program who are victims of domestic violence, dating violence, and sexual assault or stalking are protected, not limited to women, and available to all without regards to sex, gender, identity, or sexual orientation. Next slide, please. Who is not eligible for Vawa protections? Guests, unassisted household members, and live-in aides are not eligible for protection. So it's limited only to the tenants of the household. However, as a reasonable accommodation, a tenant can request Vawa protections if a live-in aide is a victim, and may request an emergency transfer for the household based on that reasonable accommodation. Next slide. Notice of occupancy rights, which is HUD Form 5380, is required to be provided to all applicants. And this form, so HUD has provided a sample of the form on their website, which I provide the link later on in the presentation. But this document should be provided to all applicants as well as all tenants, especially in a case where an applicant has been denied assistance, because if the applicant was denied assistance based on an incident relating to a sexual assault, domestic violence, or stalking incident, they can provide documentation, and then they could then potentially be eligible for assistance based on this. It should also be provided to any tenants that are moving in. And anytime a notice of eviction or termination of assistance is given to a tenant, this documentation should also be provided, just in case the incident or reason for termination or eviction is related to a Vawa incident. Next slide, please. The Vawa lease addendum. HUD Form 91067. This form includes all of the new VAWA provisions. Again, it applies to all multifamily programs, and it should have been provided to all current households at recertification, as well as new households that are moving into units. And this document basically speaks to the VAWA protections that all applicants are eligible for under federal assisted programs. And these protections would also, the lease addendum would supersede the tenant's lease and should be attached to the actual lease. Next slide, please. Documentation. Owners and agents may accept verbal requests. They also may require written certification or other documentation. Requests for written certification must be in the form of a dated letter. So if a tenant submits a request verbally and the owner is not willing to accept that verbal request, they need to provide a written letter dated and sent to the participant to inform them that they need documentation in writing. The certification form HUD 5382 must be provided along with the notice of occupancy rights under the Violence Against Women Act, which is the form that we talked about in the last slide. Owners and agents must accept certification form or other documents to validate the victim's status. Other permissible documentation can come from a professional whom the victim sought assistance from after the incident had occurred, a record from governmental law enforcement or administrative agency or court at the discretion of the owner or agent, another statement or form of evidence. Owners and agents cannot require more than one type of documentation. Next slide, please. Response time. Owners and agents may require that a tenant provide documentation within 14 business days. They may extend that time period, and they also may, the VAWA protections may also be denied if the documentation or certification is not submitted in a timely manner. Next slide. Victim's confidentiality. All victim information and documentation must be made with strict confidentiality. VAWA information should not be provided to employees or contractors unless required by law. And victim information should not be entered into any database or provided to others without consent of the victim unless required or eviction action by law. Owners and agents must secure all correspondence and personal interactions with victims to maintain confidentiality. Owners and agents should document in the tenant's file the preferred mode of communication. And a victim may designate an attorney, advocate, or secure contact for communication. And any VAWA communication should be kept separate from the tenant's regular rental assistance file. Next slide, please. Reasonable time period for establishing eligibility. So in the event that a lease is bifurcated and there's a remaining family member, the remaining family members are required to meet the statutory requirements for the housing program. So the time period from the lease date of eligibility or move out, it would be either 90 days or when the lease expires, whichever comes first. And this would be specific to a program where there is either an age or disability criteria or some other criteria because any person remaining in the unit would need to meet that eligibility criteria in order to continue to receive that federal assistance. Next slide, please. Emergency transfer plan. The Vawa Act of 2013 requires owners and agents to assist victims in making internal or external transfers when possible. Transfer to a safe unit, tenant determines what is safe. Owners and agents must create and implement an emergency transfer plan based on the HUD model form, which is HUD form 5381. And as of this point, each owner or agent should actually have an emergency transfer plan in place as it was due to take effect on June 14th of 2017. Next slide, please. So the contents of an emergency transfer plan are as followed. It defines eligibility for an emergency transfer, describes the measure of any preferences or priority given to tenants or applicants who qualify for internal or external transfer. Preference or priority must be included in the tenant selection plan for that community. Statement that preference, if any, do not supersede usual eligibility criteria. It should incorporate strict confidentiality measures. It should include policy for making internal transfers when a unit is immediately available. Policy for internal transfers when a unit is not immediately available. It should also speak to reasonable efforts that the owner or agent will take to facilitate external transfers, and they can include arrangements with other HUD housing providers or outreach to community service providers. The plan should also include outreach to community service providers, policy for requesting internal and external transfers at the same time, whether owners or agents will accept or require verbal or written transfer requests, and certification of victim status, and specify required documentation, if any. Next slide, please. Other plan requirements. Owners and agents must make the plan available upon request and when feasible, publicly available. Owners and agents must retain record of all emergency transfer requests that have been submitted and their outcomes for 3 years or a period of time as specified by their program regulations. They must define what immediately available is. For example, it could be a vacant unit ready for move-in within a reasonable time period, as well as review internal and external transfer waiting lists, policies, and the tenant selection plan to determine if changes are needed. Next slide, please. Eligibility for transfers. So if a tenant expressly requests transfer and believe that there is a threat of imminent harm if remaining in the unit, in the case of sexual assault, either the tenant believes that there is a threat or of an imminent harm or sexual assault, or the sexual assault has occurred on the premises during 90 days preceding the transfer request. Or the request does not guarantee continued assistance or an external transfer to other HUD housing, as the tenant must meet outstanding eligibility or occupancy requirements. Next slide. Preference and priority. Preferences the owner and agent may establish a preference for VAWA victims for external transfers. They can also amend tenant selection plans for VAWA preferences and do not need HUD's approval for that. Priority for internal transfers, they're also able to amend the tenant selection plan for priorities of internal transfers waiting list. Next slide. Record keeping and reporting. So under the VAWA Act, records programs are required to keep records by project and project fiscal year. They're also required to maintain the number of transfer requests and outcomes of each, as well as retain records for 3 years or as specified in program regulations. Next slide. Here's the link regarding all of the VAWA information that is provided by HUD. Next slide. Any questions? Thank you.
Okay, great. Let me stop sharing. Okay. So Russ, do you see any questions in the Q&A or the?
Put link into the chat so that people can have it if they want.
Okay. Let's see here. I don't see any questions. Does anybody have any questions? I just okay. All right, Russ, I see a question.
Any
Any reports on successful prosecutions under Vawa reported to DHCD?
Not that I am aware of.
Okay, still. Oh, Abiola asked, are there a lot of reports?
A lot of reports of VAWA complaints or VAWA protections. I'm not sure that I understand the question. Okay. So I have been here approximately 6 months, and I believe so far we've had 2 requests under all of the programs that are under my purview. So there are not a lot of requests that are coming in.
Are there any other questions?
Okay, there's one in the Marianne in the in the Q&A. It's like, does anyone know if there are regular training for property managers and staff on how to cope with people experiencing PTSD or trauma?
I can tell you, at least from my understanding in the DD population, no. If that is something that you would like to look at how we could do something on a more regular basis, feel free to send me an email and I will bring it to my boss, who's the director of all the programs for DDA. And, we can see how we can work on maybe doing a webinar or some kind of recorded presentation, see how we can get more information out to you all, for sure.
I do work with the Behavioral Health Administration, and trauma-informed care falls under one of our office directors. Darren McGregor, I will check with him and see if there's any kind of, because in the past, there has been trainings on trauma-informed care.
And I would be more than happy, and I would actually love to partner with BHA in that regard, or in any regard really, with our individuals, that because a lot of the individuals that we have in DDA that have PTSD and have these, tend to have dual diagnoses of mental health, and so BHA and DDA, I'd really like us to partner and to really provide a better safety net for those individuals, for sure.
Under this topic of trauma-informed care, and I think that that makes total sense. Sometimes we separate out the different types of disabilities. Sometimes, obviously, people have co-occurring or dual disability diagnosis and such, and we have minimal services that really cover both, but this is a topic that cuts across all lines.
Yeah, and it encompasses, even with the violence against women and domestic violence. I mean, that's trauma, and regardless of the intellectual ability of the individual that's been traumatized, trauma is trauma, and the physiological effects of the brain and how the brain shuts down. It doesn't matter if you are a Mensa, somebody with an IQ of 140, if you've been traumatized, your brain is still going to shut down the same way as an individual who has an IQ of 70. And how you respond and deal with it, across the board, people, we all need to know how to deal with somebody when they're in need. Because a lot of people are like, well, I don't know what to do. I'm not a trained clinician. Talking to somebody calmly, helping them just be calm and stay in the present, anybody can do that. You don't have to be a trained clinician to be empathetic and try to help out. So I'm more than happy to, and I know Dr. Harvey, who I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, Karen Harvey, she would also be more than willing to, and I know she works with numerous states and actually has also worked with Canada in regards to trauma-informed care and trauma supports. She's written several books specifically about trauma and IDD, but a lot of the concepts can be across the board. So yeah.
Our colleague Catherine from the Brain Injury Association has written Mental Health First Aid, maybe a good start for people experiencing PTSD and other distress. I agree with that. Hi, Catherine.
We have a question in the Q&A.
Consumer with disabilities is also a victim of domestic violence whose address is restricted info. Does the landlord property have any responsibility to respond to safety-specific, non-disability related requests to modify the property, add a peephole to the door? If so, what is the property's responsibility? That's for Lakeisha, I'm sure.
I'm sorry, let me just read the question again.
You see it in the Q&A?
I do.
Okay, because if the consumer has disabilities and is also a victim of domestic violence, The address, is the address restricted information? Does the landlord property have any responsibility to respond to safety specific, not disability related, but safety requests to modify the property at a peephole to the door? If so, what is the property's responsibility? I think modifications do have to do with disability though, but still, I mean, it's safety. There's a bunch in there if you want to dissect
Yeah.
that question.
So any modifications to a unit would, like you said, Russ, that would, refer to the disability, not necessarily the safety. And the landlord, is this a landlord of a HUD assisted program? If it is a landlord of a HUD assisted program, the landlord would not be able to provide any of the consumer's information or address, but they would not necessarily, be responsible for,
I'm thinking of whether the person is relocating to a new address, because if this is one of those situations where I like that bifurcation word, where you've removed the person, they know the address, and then it's a matter of safety and protection of the person who remains in the address. But if this is a situation where someone has moved into an address, how protected is address information if the property management landlord may or may not know that the person is a victim? If they know they're a victim, they still wouldn't know who's inquiring as to the address. I'm just thinking out loud, but it seems like that might be, it's not like our addresses are like
not necessarily public
landlord
information.
confidentiality. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the landlord would, they're not able to give out, clients' information regardless of them being a victim of domestic violence or not. However, they're not able to share any information unless the victim has, given specific people to share their information with. But as far as modifications, the landlord, if the tenant is requesting a reasonable accommodation or modification to the unit, then that would, be based on a disability, not necessarily based on safety.
And I would think that most would have the people would already be a part of the housing, most,
Right.
but if it isn't, yeah, sure, that could be added.
This is such a small caveat, and yeah, it's I would agree, like what you all are saying is 100% true. If the RA has to connect to the disability, it's not the same thing as a safety issue. Completely different, totally separate issues there. And most properties have, at least in my travels along the way, they have cameras, they have, they have limitations as to who can get into the building. So if there was an issue of some kind, that has to be reported to the property manager. Like the tenant has to do that. It's in reasonable accommodations, has to connect to disability.
Any other questions?
Christine Bolliard looks an awful lot like you, Chelsea Heyman.
Yeah, we're twins. I don't know why my picture shows up when she logs in, but she has access to my Zoom account, so that's that's why that happens, I think. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions.
The few we got were good though.
Very good. All right, well, so we have our last and final session next Thursday, everybody. We're ending on a high note here, and this was extremely helpful, this information. This is a topic that we do encounter often. A lot of people that have disabilities in our programs have experienced trauma of some kind. And, there's also more than a handful of people where we've had situations where they have some kind of background with experiencing domestic violence. So this is extremely helpful information. Thank you both Meg and Lakeisha for sharing the information with the attendees. Our last session is going to be about the survey research project we did last year with Tenants in the 811 and Weinberg programs. I have worked with an organization that did surveys and assessed for resident satisfaction. So I'll be presenting on that information to attendees. And also Marianne Graham and Lisa Waddell from the Department of Health will be having a tenant from the program share some of their experiences in the program as well. So again, I want to thank everybody for attending today. And I think we will go ahead and wrap up, and you have a little bit more time in your day now.
All
All
right.
right.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Have a
Thank
great day.
you.
Enjoy the
Take
rest of your
care.
day. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.